We made a video game in 72 hours. But before we start this video, I suggest that you go check out the game for yourself. Hosted on itch.io, linked in the description below, it is completely free, and it is the most pure way to experience the game that we were trying to put together. Go play that first if you want to avoid any spoilers. If you just want to see a full playthrough with no commentary and you don't want to download the game yourself, click here. One of the puzzles that we made involved a radio, and we had a lot of fun creating the stations for it. But we also recognized that there's no way anybody's going to sit down and listen to all of the stations. So what we did was we took all of the stations and we stitched them together along with this amazing track that Jasmine made. And an extra bonus track at that. You can find that video by clicking right here. This video is supposed to be a technical breakdown of the entire game jam. We go into all the nooks and crannies of how this game was made. If you're only interested in a specific part of the game, we split up this video into timestamps to make it easier for you to find what you're looking for. Hi, I'm the game director, Russell Higgins, and along with my husband, Apu Dutta, we're excited to welcome you to the second annual Labor Day Game Jam. Last year we came up with the team name Barky Sharky, and this year we've revived it so that we can bring you a horror-themed escape room based on the 1929 short story, The Hound of Tindalos by Frank Belknap Long. This video is meant to show the process and the dedication that went into making this game, that goes into a game jam like this one. There's no sponsors, there's no prize money, there's no competition, we don't win anything at the end of this. We're doing this just because we all love making games, we love our craft, and we want to improve. And this video is meant to show how we did it, the technical aspect of what we had to do to accomplish this goal. Before writing the script for this, we reached out to all of the devs and we asked them for feedback on what the game jam did right and what the game jam could improve on. This is usually called a post-mortem, and a lot of game companies do this. You take a look back at what you did and you decide what needs improvement. We need this feedback. We need it to grow as game devs and as artists. As such, I took their feedback and I incorporated it into this video. Every now and then you might hear me say something a little bit negative, but really what we're doing is we're trying to be honest with ourselves about where we can improve, so that next year we can make an even bigger and better game. Not everyone was able to make it from beginning to end. Sometimes life comes up. Some of them started on Friday and ended on Saturday. Others started on Saturday, ended on Monday. And one of them was a madman that started on Friday, hopped a flight, changed time zones, landed, came back, worked through Saturday, worked all the way through Sunday, stayed up all Sunday night, and then finished the project with us all together. The jam started on Friday, August 30th, and ran through Monday, September 2nd. There was a bit of both pre- and post-work jam done, but 90% of the work was done in those 72 hours between Friday and Monday. During that time, the team worked either remotely or came to our apartment and worked with us in person. The team consisted of 14 people, and at any given time, 7 of them were stuffed into our 2-bed, 1-bath apartment. Communication between the rest of the game team happened in our Discord channels. Throughout the entire process, Julian was in the wine and cheese room on Discord. If anybody had any issues, they could reach out to Julian, and if Julian didn't have the answer, he could reach out to me and I would immediately respond. With all that set up, let's get into the actual process of it. I'm going to do my best to build this game with you chronologically. But once the game jam actually starts, everything kind of happens around the same time. The programmers are off doing their own thing, every artist is working on their own individual piece, artists are hopping over and helping the programmers, audio's implementing. It starts to get a little hectic, so I've split it up into sections. Just know that once the jam starts, everything is all happening in those 72 hours. Our pre-jam begins on September 17th, where we hold an open meeting for anyone who would like to pitch us a game idea. Some of the other ideas included a rhythm-based platformer, a fractal puzzle game, and a top-down dungeon crawler with about a dozen wacky guns. A lot of these ideas also involved dogs in some way as well. Eventually we decided that we were going to use a dog in some way, but we weren't quite sure how it was going to fit into the final idea yet. In the end, we settled on a puzzle game where time travel was a major factor. We recalled a version of the Hound of Tindalos that appeared and vanished with a lightning strike and haunted time travelers specifically. In the original novel, the hounds come out of corners and edges. If I remember correctly, there was some sci-fi jargon about how lightning creates angles and the hounds could theoretically come out of those lightning because they move so quickly, and It didn't make any sense, but we liked the idea that the hounds came out of the lightning strike, so we went with it. Taking inspiration from Resident Evil, we also wanted a monster that stalked you throughout the game, something that you couldn't kill. So we looked at our art team, and we realized that we had 5 incredibly talented 3D artists. This meant that our art style was definitely going to have to be 3D. Our game design team, on the other hand, thought the puzzles would be much easier if it were a 2D layout. We also wanted to show the idea that you're traveling through time, not space. For that reason, we decided to keep the camera static, showing you the same room, aging forward and backward through time. Combine all of that and you have a 3D game with a 2D fixed camera perspective. Something like Little Nightmares 2 comes to mind. During one of the subsequent art meetings, we came up with official names for all of the characters and villains. We settled on Jim as the name for our main character and Tindalina for the hound that hunts him. The owner of the manor, Bernard Tindalos, is a time traveler who considers himself kind of an elitist. Jim is trying to pass Bernard's trials and prove that he's a worthy time traveler. Although this lore is never completely explained in the game, we kinda wanted to leave this one open-ended. With that, Apu and I began designing the puzzles. At the initial stages, we thought there would be 4 rooms, having one that would be even further back in time past the 1920s, something where the room isn't completely constructed yet, but we decided to cut that really early on for time. We settled on 3 rooms, one in the 1920s, one in the 1990s, and one in the distant future. The plan was to have the puzzles involve changing objects and items in the past in order to overcome obstacles in the future. One of the puzzles that we came up with first was the vines. The idea of water a plant in the past, and when you come to the future, that plant is now overgrown and you can climb up it. Because of that, we decided to remove the staircase in the future level where Jim spawns. The final puzzle involved taking the book that was on the table below and putting it into the bookshelf. This slides the bookshelf out of the way, revealing the final save. Jumping down off of that second platform locks you out of that area until you can grow the vines. This was my favorite puzzle of the ones that we came up with because knowingly or unknowingly, the player essentially locks themselves out of the final puzzle. The safe is behind the bookshelf where you spawn. To open the bookshelf, you need to obtain the book, which is visible the second you spawn in as well. That said, to obtain the book, you have to jump off the ledge. Jumping off the ledge means that you have to grow the vines in order to get back up. To grow the vines, you have to venture all the way back to the 1920s. So what started as something that should be, oh, get the book on the table, becomes, I have to go through all of time to solve this problem. With the puzzles completed, I began working on the GDD, Apu began working on the Chandelier, and Jalen began setting up the initial level for us. This is all about 1 week before the game jam actually begins. A game design document is essentially a manual for how we're going to build our game. If there's ever a question or a debate about something, the best practice is to check the document, so that way everyone is literally on the same page. Our document takes the form of a 56-slide PowerPoint that talks about everything from the main menu, to the inspiration for the art, to a step-by-step guide on how to beat all the puzzles. How Tindalina attacks was a point of confusion during the previous meeting, so here we break it down frame by frame in the GDD to clarify it. First, a lightning strike, then Tindalina, then a second lightning strike, then nothing. If Tindalina touches Jim at any point, Jim dies. Anything that can be interacted with is called out in this document, as well as a general layout for all of the puzzles and how they work. At this point, no one was required to do any art, but one of our artists, Sean, had done a few preliminary drawings that serve as our concept art and appear multiple times through our GDD. In addition to the environment puzzles like the chandelier and the plant, we also added minigames. These minigames were smaller puzzles that could give you clues to other parts of the level. We took the minigame aspect from Among Us and applied it here. The games themselves aren't very difficult, but Tindalina is continuously hunting you while you're trying to solve them. There's an audio cue to let you know that Tindalina is about to attack, so while you are working on this puzzle, which, again, isn't the most complicated, you're constantly listening for that audio cue in case you have to exit out of the puzzle and run away. We also talked about level checkpoints. Originally, we considered having checkpoints after completing major puzzles, but in the end, we decided to let the puzzles be their own checkpoints. For example, solving the dog jigsaw puzzle once gives you the clue Woodlawn. If you were to die and respawn, you the player know that the password is still Woodlawn, meaning you could just skip the jigsaw puzzle entirely and go directly to the computer. We called these organic checkpoints, and if you know about them, you can actually skip about half of the game. This was a conscious decision that we made, but it also definitely was a trade-off. The game being a puzzle game means that we're already going to have a low replayability. This tanks it. That said, it also makes it a lot easier on our programmers who don't have to deal with the concept of checkpoints at all. It's a decision that definitely won't work for every game, but it does work here. On an unrelated note, Woodlawn is the name of the cemetery where Frank Belknap Long is buried. Somewhere around slide 40, we realized that our idea was overscope, but we decided to give it a shot anyways. Because of that, I ended up prioritizing the items and tasks that were more important to actually finishing the game. The game ends when you open the safe. That's it. That was always going to be the end goal. So anything that doesn't directly lead to opening the safe was deprioritized and added after the fact. After the GDD was mostly complete, the artists gathered for a pre-jam meeting where we discussed the schedules and tasks. Together, we went through the GDD and listed out all of the art assets that we think would be necessary to have. We also gave those art assets a priority and assigned them out. Despite them being signed out, nobody was expected to actually start working on their assets until the Friday of. We're still more than a week away from the actual jam itself. What you're looking at now is a finished version of what we were working on, but during the time this was a living document and it was updated on the fly throughout the jam. We then used this art asset list as a base to generate the list for the programmers and the audio teams as well. One major meeting that we had before the jam was our GitHub setup. Last year we got the feedback that setting up the GitHub for everybody took up more than half of the actual jam itself, and that it'd be nice to actually be able to do that beforehand. So because of that, the weekend before was just about setting up GitHub. Apu had written up a very professional document that everyone was able to follow to get GitHub set up on their own end. Apu and I were on call all weekend in case anybody needed the support. The decision to use Git was actually pretty easy. Apu already has Git LFS, large file storage, that he's using for another project. On top of that, a lot of our programmers were already very familiar with Git. That made our choice of source control really just cut and dry. For those that don't know, source control is the idea that we're all working on the same game. We use programs like P4, Tortoise, or in this case GitHub, to keep track of the work that we do. If I want to make a change to, say, the color of the wall, I go to GitHub and I lock the asset that I want to change. In this case, it would be the level. If it's locked, when I'm working on it, nobody else can make that change. That stops us from stepping on and accidentally deleting each other's work. Then when I'm done, I can commit and push to the branch. Everyone working on the game has their own version of it on their own computers, and it's constantly being compared to the source. Pulling GitHub means that you're just updating your version of the game to match the source. In addition to this, there's also source control branches. A source control branch is a duplication of an object under version control, such as a source code file or a directory tree. That allows the developers to work on separate copies of the code base independently from the main development branch. While I worked on the GDD, Apu jumped on the Chandelier. Tackling the destruction simulation was something he was really looking forward to trying. He found a frame of a downloaded model and then retopologized it to make it better fit his needs. For those that don't know, retopologized, or retopoed, just means that the artist takes the model and then deletes all of the little lines and vertices that just aren't needed. Each deleted vertice makes the model just that much more efficient in-game. And when it comes to something like destruction sims, you need a very efficient model. He then modeled the chain links, the glass bulbs, and the part that attaches the chandelier to the ceiling. Next, he attached it to a blueprint, allowing him to lower it, turn it off, turn it on, raise it, and crash it. For the physics simulation of the crash, the glass was fractured in Unreal Engine, and the inbuilt Chaos engine was used to shatter it. For the realistic chain movement, each individual chain link was attached to the other using physics constraints to give it that swing when it hits the ground. The chandelier was going to be a major component of the game, so having this done at the start was a huge step forward. Ugh! Our programming lead, Julian, suggested using level streaming really early on in the process. He and Jalen worked together to set up the initial level and push it to our GitHub. This was done early on in the process, so that way as soon as the game jam starts, everybody could just download the level and get to work. The idea behind the level streaming is that we always have one persistent level where nothing changes. We also have 3 sub-levels that we make visible and invisible based on whatever state the level manager is in. This is far more efficient for what we're trying to do, especially in a game where the level doesn't change. But there is a major downside to it as well. Now everybody is working in the same level. That means if I make a change and you make a change and we both push, only one of our changes is actually going through and the other one is probably going to be deleted. We call this stepping on each other's work or squashing each other's work. The only real solution that we have is to be very clear about communication when somebody has the level checked out. Not all games work with this format, so for everyone but Julian, this was their first time working with level streaming. That said, Julian did a fantastic job being patient and helping everybody through the process. In the end, we only stepped on each other's work a little bit. We had a couple of ideas that for one reason or another just didn't make it into the final cut of the game. It was time. It's always time. Oh my god, every single time. The problem is time. If we had unlimited time, we would have made the next Fortnite. One of these ideas involved a mini-game with the couch. I thought it would have been funny if Jim had the option to take a nap on the couch. The minigame would appear in a little thought bubble above his head, as if he's like dreaming of sheep jumping over the fence. And every time you click on a sheep, there'd be a little bit of positive feedback. This loop would go on indefinitely until eventually one of the sheep would just be the Hound in a poorly disguised sheep costume. As soon as the Hound shows up, the Hound would appear in real life and kill Jim while he's sleeping. There was no winning this game, it was just a red herring. The entire couch idea was a red herring, just some fun set dressing that wouldn't really actively impact the gameplay, so the idea was almost immediately scrapped. There is still a version of the couch that is in-game, it's just not interactable. Another idea was to have the grandfather clock be a puzzle in some way. Instead, we decided that the clock would be better as just a symbolic item. A broken grandfather clock, as if time is broken inside the halls, which is why it's never animated. That is thematic, kinda spooky, and easier on our team, all in one go. It does explain why there's an oil can on the table next to it, too. At some point, somebody was trying to fix the clock, and no matter what they did, it just couldn't work. So the grandfather clock also doubled as a story reason for the oil can to be there, which was just a nice bonus. We actually had a lot of story interactables that were scrapped for time. Certain things like when you pick up the book for the first time, there was going to be a description of how Tindalina attacked. Another thing would be a note on the table that would explain what the oil can is doing there, or an interactable with a painting of Bernard Tindalos who just tells you who that guy is. All of these were scrapped because we just didn't have the time to put it in. The jigsaw puzzle in the 1920s was originally supposed to be a slider puzzle, but halfway through making it, Apu, the programmer assigned to it, realized that the slider puzzle just didn't work well with the aspect ratio of the painting. A jigsaw puzzle, on the other hand, was easier to code and worked with every aspect ratio. Finally, the computer hacking minigame was going to be more like the Strands puzzle that's posted daily in the New York Times. The word you would have been looking for was woodlawn, and you wouldn't know that until you solved the jigsaw puzzle. This idea, though, was cut about halfway through day 2, as having a simple password input just made life easier for everybody involved. Our initial kickoff meeting was at 5 p.m. on Friday. People that had the day off began working in the morning, but 5 p.m. was the initial meeting where we actually said, this is officially started. We all gathered in the wine and cheese room and talked through all 57 slides of the GDD. Everyone got their initial assignments, and people who didn't have to stick around for the initial gray block meeting went to work in their respective fields. Each field had its own channel in the Discord in case anybody needed to communicate. It was also decided that the art and audio team would all update on the same Google Sheet file to keep track of each other's progress and make notes on different tasks. The programmers branched off and used Asana, a production tool that allows the user to create subtasks, which is more important to programmers than it is to artists and audio devs. All hand meetings were held at 10 a.m., 5 a.m., and 8 p.m. every day over Discord. During these meetings, we would simply touch base and talk about what we were working on, if there was anything that was blocking us, and what we were planning on working on next. We had 3 voice channels to choose from: the Wine and Cheese Room, the Noggins Chamber, and Denny's. Immediately following the kickoff meeting, we held a gray block meeting. A gray block is just a level mock-up where we can move items and objects around before the actual art is done. It helps us to get this meeting out early so that way we can make sure that the gameplay feels right. We make a new level in Unreal and we only use easy to place gray blocks. These gray blocks can be distorted, changed in size, scale, whatever we need them to do to fit generally where this object is going to go. Every gray block is assigned an art asset, and those art assets are reflected in the art asset list that we showed earlier. This is how we know that we're going to have enough art to actually finish the game. Jalen had set up most of the level streaming as part of the gray block that he already pushed. Everything was then tweaked by Bruce and Emmy to better represent the gameplay and the scale of the world. The environment artist and the game designers all gave feedback to ensure that all the fields had a say in the overall layout of the map. One thing that was heavily debated was the placement of the windows. Originally, we were going to make the windows transparent and have a rudimentary scene that sort of just shows off the environment and changing seasons. We had to drop that in favor of having thick frosted glass, but the window placement was still widely talked about. One of our clues involves lighting the chandelier and raising it to reveal a note scratched in the dark corner of the room. Wherever the windows go, we had to make sure that that note wasn't visible. That corner had to be dim. If we put it next to a bright window, it wouldn't be. Our solution was to change the 1920s to be nighttime in order to hide the clue. With that completed, the game jam was officially underway. At this point, everything sort of just happens at the same time, so it's impossible to structure this video chronologically. Step 1 to programming any kind of game is making the basic interactions. Walking, jumping, that kind of stuff. The basic movement and interactions were first set up by Andre before Julian went in and added the ability to interact with the items in the room by hitting E on the keyboard. This also included locking the movement to 2 directions, left and right. Andre also stopped the player from moving when the minigame was active. Finally, included in this task was freezing the camera in one place. We needed the camera to be static to drive home the idea that you are looking at the same room in different time periods, not 3 distinct rooms. To do that, we needed a programmer to actually lock the camera in place. With the basic movement set up, Julian then went in and added the ability to jump between tracks. We have a foreground track and a background track, each with their own clues and interactables. You can jump between the tracks using the E button at specific points along them. The menus were also done by Andre. Originally, we were going to have an options menu and an art gallery menu, but we ended up cutting those for time. Final tweaks on the menu were done by Apu about a day after the game jam ended. This happened while we were packaging the final game to be pushed to itch. A lot of the basic level streaming was actually set up before the game jam even started. We wanted to make sure that right at the beginning of the jam, everyone had the file that they could download and just start working on. Julian helped Jalen start to set up the streaming level, which he then used to set up the rest of the file with. The most important part of level streaming is that we need to retain scene data between streaming. Jalen tackled this, and it's why if you crashed the Chandelier in the 90s, it still crashed in the future. Another important note on the level streaming is that most objects don't change between scenes, just the texture. Apu used the level streaming to simply just swap the textures out and make the objects look older. This saves us the computing time of loading in all new assets every time the scene loads up. Our game can be broken up into Interactables and Minigames. The Interactables are something that the player can use to change their environment, while the Minigames are widget-based games that pop up on screen, prompting the player to complete them before continuing. The key word there is widget. If it's a pop-up, it's a minigame. If there's no pop-up, it's an interactable. Julian made a master blueprint for all of the interactables, which made it a lot easier to make sweeping changes when it was needed. The most complicated interactable by far was the Chandelier. The actual art aspect was handled by Apu, but the initial implementation was on Jalen. Jalen and Apu worked together to get the finished version that's in the game today. It's the only object in the game that needs to be interacted with for 2 different reasons in 2 different scenes. Bruce's help was also paramount to the Interactables. He made it so that you could grow the vines, you could move the bookshelf, and that you could pick up the items that were in the game. When there's a pop-up on screen, we call this interaction the minigame, although this isn't necessarily a universally used term. These games are played inside of the UI and use what's called a widget to interact with them. Just like with the Interactables, Julian hooked up a minigame master blueprint that could be reused anytime a new minigame was added. The radio itself went through a number of iterations. Upon entering the room, there was a bug where all of the radio stations would play at once out loud, blowing out the player's eardrums.
6, 7, 3.
Clicking any button on the radio would solve this issue, but the bug would reset if the player left and re-entered the room. Jalen designed this radio, and then Jalen and Julian worked together on the final version that works as expected. Meanwhile, Mike and Emmy were working diligently on the keypad puzzle that ended the game. Apu began work on the slider puzzle, and halfway through development, as you know, he swapped it out for the jigsaw, which was a great call for everybody involved. The jigsaw was easier and it made more sense. This is also where we decided to scrap the strands puzzle idea in favor of the simple computer login. The inventory system and the UI were a major hurdle for the team. Thankfully, we had Bruce focusing heavily on the inventory. Handling the UI in Unreal proved to be far more difficult than we first expected. We couldn't figure out how to change the UI we already placed. Instead, we changed what's called a brush component of the UI object to change the picture. When the image is blank, it's not actually blank. It's a perfect square that's the exact same color as the background. Ideally, we would have liked to use an array to control the inventory. An array is just a collection of values. Adding and subtracting stuff from that array should be relatively easy, in theory. However, using that array to place our picked up items just never worked. Our solution was to manually check each instance of the inventory system to find the first one that was open based on what brush was being used. If it's the square we just talked about, we know it's empty and equipable items can be placed there. A similar method was used for changing the background textures to tell which slot was equipped. It was just on a different layer. The audio programming was mainly handled by Julian, although at times Jasmine, Apu, Jalen, and myself all made changes to the audio programming. Julian set up an audio table that allowed us to play a random sound effect from the list that we put together. This made it super easy for anybody to add SFX into the game. Simply add it to the audio table and we should be able to hook it up from there. In general, having one dedicated audio programmer could have been very useful. Julian did a fantastic job, but having one programmer who could spend the entire jam just working with Jasmine could have really smoothed the entire pipeline over. One debate that we had was implementing WWise throughout the game. WWise is a plugin for audio mixing that would have allowed programmers and audio designers more engine tools to control the audio with. Because the camera is fixed, spatial sound wasn't really important. Objects don't move far enough away from you that their sound disappears. Looking into it, we see many programmers having horror stories about working with WWise, saying that it's very complicated and that the program makes implementation a lot harder. For that reason, we decided against it this year, but next year it's definitely something we'll look into.
But of course!
Audio in general is one of the most important aspects in any media, especially horror. We were blessed to have Jasmine writing our backing tracks and editing them together with the ambient sounds of just being in a haunted mansion. She wrote 5 tracks for this project, 1 for each level, a main menu, and 1 for an art gallery. The art gallery was scrapped when we realized that it would be a lot of extra work and we were just going to show the art off in this video anyways. We still liked the work that Jasmine did, so we took that art gallery track and we made it the end credits. If there was more time, Jasmine said she would have liked to ease the loop of the music, but overall, the final tracks came out great and really set the tone for the rest of the game.
Well, I've never seen a hound like that before.
While Jasmine began work on the music, I started adding basic audio to the game. essentially gray blocking the audio with placeholder SFX. Once Jasmine was done with the music, she sifted through my SFX and she upgraded everything she could. One theme that we wanted permeating throughout the rest of the game was the idea of time. Jasmine went through her libraries and found clock ticks specifically from the 1920s and the 1990s. She then invented a clock tick for the future as well. She then took the rhythm of that clock and sort of messed it up a little bit because time in the halls is broken. We wanted the game to feel dark and creepy in general, but the design for Jim was a little bit more whimsical, as if he accidentally wandered into a horror game from a safe-for-work safari adventure. We decided to lean into this, giving him a brazen, self-important personality from the voice acting.
One small step for me, one giant leap for, well, me.
The voice acting intentionally contrasts with the rest of the audio in the game. All of the sound throughout the game is very grounded and realistic and gritty, and it sounds like the sound could hurt you. Which is why we decided to lean into the lightheartedness of Jim's design. The voice acting was just a lot of fun for everybody involved. I had set up a recording area, and everyone who wanted to add their voice in some way did. I performed Jim's voice lines with the people around me, giving some suggestions for him to say.
Jimothy Thunderthighs at your service. Jimothy Thunderthighs.
One of the puzzles was a radio where one of the stations gives you a code. We didn't want the rest of the stations to just be static, so we hid a lot of fun Easter eggs in there. Our character artist, Sean, has this tendency to make what we call Sean noises while she works. She recorded some of those into a track for us called Void Noises. We then added a track of our programmer Jalen doing a radio jockey voice introducing her.
Hello, and welcome back. You've been listening to Void Noises by Woman Trapped in Void. I'm your host, Man Locked in Radio. We'll be here for a long time, so make yourself a cup of tea and don't touch that dial. I'm not going anywhere, and certainly neither is she.
We had a lot of fun, and it reminded us of Welcome to Night Vale.
A friendly desert community where the sun is hot, the moon is beautiful, and mysterious lights pass overhead while we all pretend to sleep. Welcome to Night Vale.
As mentioned, these radio stations were uploaded in a separate video, along with all of Jasmine's compositions and a bonus track where Jim sings Out of Time Man by Mick Harvey. For as fun as the voice acting was, I do think we went a little bit overboard with Jim's voice lines in particular. The initial reason we wanted to add some lines was to give some feedback when you tried something and it didn't work.
I don't understand.
That escalated into also giving feedback when you tried something and it succeeded.
God, I'm smart.
Then feedback when you won the game.
Victory screech. Loodle-leedle-leedle-leedle-lee.
Feedback when you died. And even feedback when you've been standing around for too long.
The time coefficient. Then I take the 1.
I think we overstimulated the player by adding too many voice lines. A classic mistake, and it's entirely on me. If we were to do it all over again, I wouldn't cut them entirely, but I would revisit them and assess which ones are actually necessary. If we were selling this game, trying to make a profit off of it, we would probably revisit Jim entirely. The design, what he can do, how he talks. It'd probably be better to have him be more grounded, but with this being a game jam that we just did for fun, Jim was a lot of fun to put together and I wouldn't change that. The UI art is the way the user can tell what options they have to select from and what object they're trying to actively use. It's not something the character can interact with, it's ways to convey information to the player about the character. In other games, this would be a health bar or a stamina bar. Originally, we were going to have a clean UI, with Minecraft being our key reference. Towards the beginning, though, we decided that a notepad would be more in character. Apu was hard at work on the UI, which was already in line art. All of our minigames were UI, made using widgets. To keep in line with the art style, almost every 2D asset was first modeled in 3D before being painted over to look 2D. We wanted to make sure that the keypad and the notebook in particular fit the style. So once we had those 2D assets, we reassembled them using the widgets that could be interacted with by the player. The only 2D assets that were not created in 3D first were Sean's painting of Bernard and Johnny's painting of Tindalina. You may have also noticed that there are 2 other paintings on the wall. These are actually official presidential portraits from the president of that time period, Bill Clinton and Calvin Coolidge. The objects themselves were being updated through the materials, but transferring through time needed a bit more of a push. We hoped that by tying the rooms to widely known historical figures, we could convey that you are indeed traveling through time. The first versions of the floor, base trim, and wall base were all done by Zephyrin before life came up and he had to pass the work over to Apu, who made the rest of the variations. Sean put the finishing touches on it by adding that trim that we see in all the levels. Any artist that could model was modeling during this game jam. All of our artists worked very hard divvying up the props to model. Apu did all of these. Angel did all of these. Johnny did all of this. And Sean did all of these. In the basic pipeline, each prop was made in Maya where it was modeled and UV unwrapped before being brought through Substance where it was given textures. Apu made a smart material for Substance Painter that automatically adds wear and tear on whatever object it's used on. The artist then exported the model and the 3 variations of the materials which were hooked up in Unreal using a blueprint. The blueprint changes the texture's instance based on what level is currently active. A few of the assets were found for free on Quixel and CG Trader, a plugin for Unreal that allows you to find public domain megascans. This was perfect for stuff like the debris and the decals. All of the artists had a hand in placing the props in the level, but Angel had the final pass when she was doing her lighting. After this pass, there were no more gray blocks. We had a list of all the VFX items we needed to make. My primary job outside of this game jam is as a VFX artist, so I quickly got to making as many of these effects as possible on the first night. The standout effect is definitely Tindalina's attack. Tindalina has 3 different Niagara systems in her attack. A lightning strike in the beginning of it, the smoke and lightning coming off of the back of her, and an electric portal in case she runs into a wall, although we're not 100% sure if that was ever completely hooked up. Tindalina's smoke was made by accident. I was attempting to add what's called an AB layer. It's a silhouetted version of the effect that goes behind the primary effect to help the primary effect stand out. This makes the lightning pop. Instead, I accidentally ended up making a version of what looks like smoke. With a little tweaking, this happy accident became part of the effect. Other notable effects include the falling debris from the chandelier, the death animations, and the wind condition. The rain was placed by Apu, having been made about 2 months ago for a previous assignment of his. The main villain of our adventure, Tindalina, was created and named by Johnny. Tindalina had what was known as a high poly mesh that was modeled in ZBrush. Maya is fantastic for modeling solid objects like shelves and bookcases, but ZBrush is far better for more organic modeling. He then began the tedious process of actually modeling the character, something that takes a lot of skill and time to get right. A high poly mesh means that your model has a lot of vertices that the computer has to think about. Putting her in-game as a high poly mesh would probably break the game. So once this mesh was done, we baked the polys into the mesh. You can think of baking a model the same way you think of baking a clay sculpture. It's now far more difficult to make changes on things that are already there, but your sculpture is now sturdy. With the model done, the next step was adding the bones on the inside of the creature that could be animated, also known as rigging. Tindalina is supposed to be a Lovecraftian creature. Her front legs were supposed to be that of a greyhound, while her back legs morphed into the mixture of smoke and lightning. As such, we only had to model and rig the front half of her. Johnny found a Python-based quadruped auto-rigger, but the documentation wasn't all there, and the Python code simply wasn't working. At the end of the day, Apu and Johnny scrapped the auto rig in favor of reskinning Tindalina onto an existing rig that they found online. This presented us with a new problem. Do we go through the process of making IK restraints that could save us a lot of animation time, or do we suck it up and try and animate without them? Those IK restraints would make it so that if we moved the lower paw, the rest of the arm would move with it. Without it, moving the lower paw just deforms the mesh. But setting up the IK restraints is going to take a while in its own right, so it becomes a choice. The good news is that the only thing we needed her to do was run in a straight line. Because this dog was such a unique model, animating her was a challenge for the team. How does a dog whose back half is smoke run? On top of that, an arguably bigger problem is that none of the artists are animators. We have a ton of modelers and illustrators and technical artists, but nobody on our team knew how to just make things move. We knew the steps, but nobody specialized in it. Because of the limited amount of animation work that we'd have to do for her, we opted to not make the IK restraints and go directly into the animating. Animating Tindalina was, rough. I tried my hand at it, but at the end of the day, Apu stepped in and got us a version that could work for what we needed.
Haha!
Our character's name is never spoken at any point during the game, but internally we dubbed him Jim Thunderthighs. Based on these initial drawings by Sean, I suggested looking at the Safari Hunter from Jumanji as the key reference. Sean began modeling the character in ZBrush and Nomad Sculpt before passing it over to Angel to be retopoed. While Angel did that, Sean continued working on the textures, bringing them through Substance Painter. She said that this was the most difficult part of the process, as Substance Painter had a tendency to crash. Often. Jim has the physique of a silverback gorilla, meaning that we couldn't just use the default rig from Unreal. Apu brought Jim into Mixamo, a free rigging and animation software. The walking, jumping, and idle animations were exported and chopped up before being reassembled with the blueprints in Unreal. If we had more time, we'd probably like to add a few more animations to Jim. Raising his hand to the door when he exits the room, or actually climbing the vines, would have been nice to see, but as it was, we just barely got Jim in under the wire, so we're very proud to have gotten the animations that we have in. Once the textures were in, we had two effects that needed to be attached. The first was for when Jim died, and the second was for when Jim time traveled at the end. Both of these effects were Niagara particle systems that spawned based on Jim's skeletal mesh and the material, meaning that they had to be added at the end of the process. Jim was one of the last assets to go into the game. Until then, we'd been testing with Manny, the default Unreal mannequin. The lighting was an important final push. Until we get the lighting in there, the game just feels unfinished. Some lights are placed by effects. The computer sparks and the lightning come to mind. Others are placed by puzzles, like the light bulb in the chandelier or the skylight in the future room. But the rest of the actual lighting was done by Angel, who absolutely knocked it out of the park. There's a little bit of a Git mix-up towards the end of the last day that squished some of her changes, but Apu was able to eventually recover everything for the final build, and we couldn't be happier with how it turned out. It's now 12:30 on Monday, and it's time for the playtest. This playtest has already been moved once. Caleb did a fantastic job setting up the playtest. Both the tests were recorded, and Caleb's notes were impeccable. Unfortunately, there was no way to beat the game when this playtest came around. We were simply out of time, and this is a problem that happens frequently with game jams. This was personally where I believe I could have improved the game as a game director. There's something called a minimum viable product, or an MVP. What are the bare bones components that you need to play and complete your game? Take Mario for example. Mario is still Mario without Goombas, without pipes, without flags, without castles. All you need for Mario's minimum viable product is a guy, a finish line, the ability to jump, and a hole to fall down. That's it. For us, we needed the safe and the ability to reach it. When we got to the playtest, we had neither. We never should have tried to test a puzzle game that didn't have a way to complete the puzzle. The game didn't have the assets it needed to tell the story, nor the gameplay it needed to complete it. We set ourselves up for failure here, and it's entirely on me. But we soldiered past it, and we got some pretty good feedback. One kind of funny mistake that happened was that Tindalina is supposed to appear every 10 to 60 seconds. For debugging purposes though, we set her spawn to every 5 seconds, making the game actually impossible. The audio across the board was a little loud. Jasmine hadn't had a chance to adjust all the audio that I added yet, so the audio just felt unbalanced. Spamming the jump button made the voice lines repeat, which was kind of funny but also a little annoying. The interaction pop-up timing felt off, and that's something we still haven't quite fixed. This is definitely something where if we had one more day, we absolutely could have fixed it, but we just ran out of time. And the time travel aspect wasn't really represented. The playtesters thought that they were in 3 separate rooms that were stacked on top of each other, not in 3 separate time periods. The playtesters were looking at a lot of gray block assets, so the time travel didn't shine through. More than anything, that just goes to show how important the artwork was. All of this gave us a direction to go in for the last push. I would definitely have another playtest next year, but we need to make sure that the minimum viable product is actually met before we have it. Sunday, September 1st, before the playtest. Most of the team decided to stay up the entire night and push to the finish.
It is 3 in the morning and we have all just decided we're staying up. We're doing it.
The original plan was for everyone to be given their last assignment at 2 p.m. on Monday, September 2nd, and be done around 3. At 8 a.m., Johnny asks everybody what they want for breakfast, before getting distracted and going back to work. Around 2 o'clock, I ask if anybody wants to break for lunch, to which everybody said no. A few people had snacks on hand, but no one hanging out at our apartment had eaten or slept in 15 hours. This was a bunch of friends who were so hyper-focused on putting out a finished product that no one slept or ate until 6 p.m. the next day. I'd consider this the same way I'd consider a Halo LAN party. Everybody was actually having fun. We were enjoying each other's company. We were working on something that we were all passionate about, and that passion just came from a really real place. Everyone put in their own effort. Everyone got to paint on this canvas, and it was just so great to see everyone come together like this.
Perhaps not.
No game jam is complete without a few bugs sprinkled in there for flavor. Our most notable bug right now involves Tindalina. Her attack range varies dramatically on different computers, and we've never quite figured out why. We think it has something to do with the aspect ratio of the computer, but seeing as the game jam ended more than 72 hours ago, I don't think we're going to be able to fix it. Another bug is with the inventory system. Using an item requires you to deselect it and then reselect it before you can actually use it. This bug wasn't noticed until recently. It actually might have only appeared after the game jam for all we know, but if this bug is still there, it might trip a couple people up. Other than that, this 1 GB game requires a nuclear reactor to run at full strength. The game is very unoptimized, which, again, makes sense for a game jam. We keep optimization in mind while we're making the initial creation of the assets, but even then there should always be an optimization pass, which we simply just never prioritized. We finished putting the last of the assets in at 6 p.m. on the last day, 4 hours after we were supposed to be done. We simply didn't have time for an optimization pass. All in all though, none of these bugs completely break the game, and we're still incredibly happy with what we put out, especially considering the time constraints we set for ourselves.
Victory screech! Loodle-leedle-leedle-leedle-lee.
After the game jam, the team went back to their day-to-day lives. School started back up for most of us. I started piecing together this video, and Apu and Julian fixed a couple of the bugs. I'm writing this script Thursday, September 5th at 9:30 p.m. Apu is sitting across from me, still fixing one last bug just before the final build. Over the course of the last 2 days, everyone slept on Tuesday, we fixed a few bugs and generally polished the final game. We like to say that we finished this game in 72 hours, and in a sense, we did. By the end of the push, we had the MVP. The changes made after the fact are all small casual fixes done while I was writing the script up. We're not doing this for sponsors or money, nobody's getting paid, we're just doing this because it's something that we're all passionate about. Learning how to do it better and growing with the peers that we respect and admire. If you are a recruiter interviewing anyone in this video for any professional position in game dev, I, Russell Higgins, can say that every single person in this video has my full recommendation. Every single person worked their ass off, and in the end, we have a game that we can all be proud of.
Alright. Everybody say Barky Sharky! Barky Sharky!
Oh, it's a video.